Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading Time with Pickle. So we're just gonna pick right up where we left off in the last episode. What I remember is that things are finally starting to pick up a little bit with there being the murder of one of the hall monitors, and Felix, which is Dan's roommate, discovered that murder, and then Dan himself discovered that Jordan's roommate Yi was kind of propped up, I guess not dead, but maybe injured or passed out and propped up in the same way that the hall monitor was. It looks like they tried to touch base or let a cop know who's kind of just brushing them off. We're getting pretty close to the end here, so I think we're finally reaching the third act. So let's just see where this goes. Again, in my last video, I had mentioned that I think it's either Jordan who's the killer or Felix. What's really odd is that both Dan and Abby have these connections to either the previous patient or the warden at the asylum. There's something going on with Jordan, but he really doesn't have any kind of connection yet. And I'm thinking in this final act, we're going to start seeing more of that, or at least I hope so. So let's start right at chapter 29. The next day, classes were canceled, leaving Dan to spend most of the day in the quad watching the students who were leaving the program. Abby had several friends who had chosen to go, and she wanted Dan and Jordan there with her for the farewells. He hadn't expected such a simple task to end up exhausting him, but standing there while person after person gave him frightened or pitying looks really ground down his nerves. They wore their thoughts plainly. They thought he was insane to stick with the program. Felix chose to stay. Dan welcomed his companionship. He couldn't fathom sleeping there alone. Drained as he was from the long day, Dan should have fallen right to sleep that night. But even though his body was tired, his mind was restless. He kept going in and out of sleep in half-hour stretches. Finally, the clock on Dan's nightstand read 2:57. Felix snored in the neighboring bed. The open window let in a chill breeze that blew the curtains around. Realizing he'd never get to sleep at this rate, Dan decided to get a snack from the vending machines. Careful not to make a sound, he slid out of bed, pulled on a flannel shirt, and grabbed his phone and his wallet. He decided not to change his sweatpants, reasoning that if a cop saw him, it would seem less suspicious if he looked fresh out of bed. He could always claim to be a sleepwalker. He shut the door softly and moved down the hall. No cops in sight. On tiptoes, he crept silently down the stairs to the first floor, willing himself not to think about Yi and Joe. He peered down the corridor, but again, no cops. Where were they all? He had just reached the vending machines and reached out in his pocket for change when a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. He turned quickly and let out a gust of a sigh. It was only Jordan. "You scared the crap out of me, Jordan." And that was an understatement. Dan pressed his palm against his chest, feeling the hammer of his pulse. "Sorry, man. Didn't mean to. I thought you'd know it was me. Anyway, what do you want to see me for?" he whispered. "What are you talking about?" Dan was confused. "You invited me here?" Jordan sounded irritated. "I thought it was important." "No, I definitely didn't. It's 3 in the goddamn morning. I don't feel like messing around," Jordan muttered. "At least come up to my room so the cops don't catch us." When they were safely back upstairs, Jordan took out his phone. He flipped it open and showed Dan his message inbox. Sure enough, there was a text sent from Dan's number asking Jordan to meet him at the vending machines at 3 o'clock to discuss something urgent. "Satisfied?" Jordan asked. What could he say? Dan blinked at the message, his heart sinking. He had absolutely no memory of sending that text. In fact, he hadn't even considered asking Jordan or anyone to meet him. He decided to get a snack only a few minutes ago. How could he have possibly planned for this? I swear, Jordan, I didn't send that. He sounded like he was pleading. Check your phone. What? Check it now. I want to see your sent messages. He held his open hand, waiting for Dan to produce the phone. I don't know what this proves, Dan muttered, but he remembered the strange emails that had shown up on his phone, so he wasn't even surprised when he saw the message in his sent folder. It didn't matter because he hadn't sent it. He was sure. But Jordan wouldn't believe him. This is bullshit, Dan, Jordan hissed. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms. I really can't deal with whatever you're up to right now. Whatever game you're playing, Yee's in the hospital, I'm sleeping all alone in this creepy freaking dump, and now you're whatever this is. Jordan rubbed his head. I think you should leave now. I need some sleep. Suddenly making his friend believe him was more important to Dan than anything. He needed someone to tell him he wasn't losing his mind. Jordan, you have to trust me. I didn't send this. I don't know who did, but... Dan looked again at his phone, and Jordan's, which may as well have been surgically grafted to his palm since he was never without it. Could he be behind all the unexplained messages? No, it was a ridiculous idea. Impossible. Dan was just grasping at straws now and looking for anyone to blame. Anyone other than yourself. But it's in your phone, so you're clearly full of it. Why are you even bothering to deny it? Jordan was asking. What's the point? Look, this is stupid. I didn't send you that text. I'm going back to bed. Yeah, run away, Dan. Real mature. Dan left in a frustrated huff. The dorm was empty as he returned to his room, no sign of cops or hall monitors. When he unlocked his door and stepped in, he knew right away that something was wrong. No Felix. Before he had time to process this, the phone in his hand leapt to life, vibrating and lighting up. He nearly chucked it across the room in surprise. He looked at the screen, hoping the message was from Jordan or Abby. Instead, it was from an unknown number. Dan's hand trembled as he opened the message. You can be one of them too. You can be immortal. Bend you, pose you with a smirk or a frown. I'm waiting on the 5th floor, Daniel, to sculpt you. No way, Dan whispered. He held the cell phone close to his face as if reading it from a different angle would change the words somehow. You're not going, of course. You're going to do the smart thing and show this to the cops. Someone is trying to screw with you. His mind jumped back to Felix. Where was he? Dan had a sinking feeling. Felix must have woken up, found him missing, and gone looking for him. But what if he'd accidentally found the sculptor instead? Could he be on the 5th floor? Dan had to find him before it was too late. His mind was made up, but he wasn't stupid. He'd get a cop to go with him, even though the cops thought the sculptor was dead. He had proof now that the sculptor was alive and well, and out to get him. Anyone could have written that message, a pesky voice reminded him. Even you said there could be a copycat. Either way, Dan thought, this was the person responsible for Joe and Yi. Real deal or copycat, he'd find out who was behind it all. But when Dan left the room for the second time that night, he discovered that there were still no cops. He checked the 2nd floor and then the 1st, backtracking all the way to the vending machines. There must have been an emergency in town or something. The Camford police force wasn't exactly huge. Dan took one last lap of the 1st floor, but it was silent. There was no more time. He would have to go alone or risk Felix becoming the next victim. Dan raced up the stairs, actually hoping to make enough noise to rouse someone. Maybe the cops were on the 5th floor already. But when he reached the top of the stairs and turned the corner, Dan knew that was just a foolish hope. The floor was silent and someone had cut the lights. Dan groped along the wall for a panel of switches but could find only one. The wind outside howled and the wind outside howled, and the overhead eaves, old and probably rotting, groaned in answer. Dan passed one door on his right, clenching his fists to fight the nerves tingling at the base of his spine. He had just enough light to see that the room was empty. The next room was empty too, and the next, but suddenly Dan heard a voice in that last room, and he moved stealthily toward it. Please don't hurt me. Felix. He quickened his pace. Please. It was Felix again. Dan had never heard anyone whimper like that. A young man reduced to a frightened little child. Dan stepped as softly as he could. If anyone was going to give him away, it would be his labored breathing. His throat had tightened so much. Each suck of air came in with a wheeze. Pressing against the wall, he inched his head around the corner, dreading what he would find. Whatever he expected, it wasn't a man who was 6'3" and carrying a crowbar. He was standing over the slumped body of Felix. Dan must have made a sound because the man turned to look at him, passing his crowbar from hand to hand. He was wearing black gloves. Dan couldn't stop looking at them. Murderers wore black gloves. Do something. Dan had never been a hero or an athlete, but an instinct he didn't recognize, one that came from a deep well of anger, drove him into the lounge. He charged, shouting, looking Rambo in his head, but probably drunken Buffalo in reality. It didn't matter. The man with the crowbar staggered back in surprise, falling to the floor when Dan crashed into him, hard. Dan heard a loud crack and hoped he'd busted one of the guy's ribs. He brought his knee up, aiming to connect with the man where he knew it would really hurt, but the man parried Dan's blow with a kick of his own. Hands as tough as steel wrapped around Dan's forearms and pulled them apart. Dan was no longer pinning the man down. The man rolled over and shoved him on the floor. You little shit, he hissed. Help, Dan screamed as loudly as he could, but the man's hands were pressed so heavily on his chest that it sounded like a whisper. Dan's head smacked the carpet, paper-thin padding over concrete, judging by how much it hurt. His vision swam. Blacks and blues and purples all meshing together, inseparable. This was it. He was going to die. Time seemed to slow. Moments stretched apart like tufts of cotton being pulled further and further until he heard shouts and the sound of feet pounding down the hall. Damn it, said the man. Jumping up, he ran to an open window and disappeared through it, just moments before two cops barreled into the lounge, guns drawn. Their voices bounced, muted, as if his skull had become an empty echo chamber. Dan tried to sit up, but his head just hurt too damn much. He fell back to the floor. Can you hear me? Hey, are you all right? Did you hit your head? He stared up at the officer. Teague. Are you okay? Can you stand? That remained to be seen. At least his vision was starting to piece itself back together. Dan tried to nod. Ow. Bad idea. The window, he slurred, trying to point the cops to where the man had escaped. Call an ambulance, an officer was saying to his partner. He was kneeling at Felix's side. This one needs to get to the hospital. He's been hit. A blanket appeared from somewhere, and the cop draped it over Felix. Can't have him going into shock. Another blanket was wrapped around Dan's shoulders. Fine, Dan insisted. The man, through the window. A moment later, Teague helped him to his feet. The cops let him regain his balance. and the ache in his head gradually subsided as they waited for the paramedics. The ambulance came, and they put Felix on a stretcher. He was stirring as they left the room and trying to sit up. Soon, Dan heard the sound of an ambulance moving away. Dan stood on wobbly legs while they took his name and room number and contact information for his parents. The guy is getting in the way, he said desperately. You can still catch him if you go now. He's probably still on the roof. One of the cops ran over to the window and checked around outside. Finally, he turned back to them with a shrug. There's no one out there, he said, and it's a good 50-foot drop down to the ground. He's out there, Dan shouted. Whoa, calm down, buddy, Teague said. Start at the beginning. What were you doing up here in the first place? Teague took out a notepad and pencil. Dan wanted to cry. I got up to go to the bathroom, he said, not wanting to touch the thing with Jordan and the mysterious text message. When I got back to my room, Felix was gone. He's been frazzled lately. He was the one who found Joe in the stairs. The sculptor sent me this weird poem thing and told me he would sculpt me if I met him on the 5th floor. I was scared Felix was with him, so I went looking. I didn't want him wandering alone at night. Uh-huh, Teague said. He motioned for Dan to continue, but then a third cop strode up to them. She handed Teague a phone, Felix's phone. I think you should see this, she said. And you need to confiscate this kid's cell. Dan swallowed around a knot, the hot, sick feeling in his gut enough to make him want to double over and hurl. Both cops stared at him, waiting. What's on Felix's phone? Dan asked, stumbling over the words. When had it gotten so hot in the room? He was sweating bullets. Please, I'm sure I can explain if you just... Yeah, I'm sure you can. Your phone, please. But your phone. Teague narrowed his eyes. I'm not going to ask you again. It was no use protesting. Maybe this was for the best. It was no use protesting. Maybe this was for the best. His outbox probably had a message like, Hello, Felix. I would very much like to bash your brains in with a crowbar. Somehow it would happen. Then he'd be taken to jail and locked up. At least then he couldn't get into any more trouble. He'd be left alone with his thoughts, and that would finish him off without ever needing a trial. Then Dan remembered he had a message from the sculptor in his inbox. Now the police would have to believe him, and they could trace the number. Dan handed Teague the phone. It would all be over soon. Teague found his sent message quickly. Bingo, he said triumphantly. 5th floor lounge, 3:30. I've got something cool to show you. He clucked his tongue softly. Just what was on Felix's phone. Sounds friendly enough, kid. What went wrong? I didn't send that, Dan snapped, ballistic. I didn't, I swear to you. Do I look like an idiot? Teague asked. Check my inbox, Dan burst out. I told you there's a message there from the sculptor telling me to meet him there. Teague looked at him strangely, but clicked on the inbox. There was a pause. Nothing there, kid. No mysterious message. And like I said before, the sculptor's dead. This was getting worse by the second. The sweat had soaked through the front of Dan's shirt. He wanted to curl up and disappear. Why don't you tell me what really happened? Dan took a deep breath. Honestly, I don't even know anymore, he said. Teague narrowed his eyes. I tried to find a cop before I came up here, but no one was around. Kid, we've got cops on every floor. Kid, we've got cops on every floor. There wasn't one when I left my room, Dan shouted. All I know is I got to the 5th floor and heard Felix crying out for help, so I came in here and there was this huge guy with a crowbar and I ran at him. Go on, said Teague. We were fighting and then he heard you guys coming and he jumped out that window. Dan pointed to it again, feeling especially stupid. Teague looked at Dan and slowly shook his head. Okay, kid, let's go along with you for now. Let's say there's this mystery man who climbs out of a window on the 5th floor after attacking your best friend. Have you ever seen this man before? Never, Dan replied, locking eyes firmly with Teague. The cop hesitated, looking Dan over and chewing the inside of his cheek. You know, the weird thing is, I almost believe you. You're either in the middle of one hell of a frame-up job, or you're a damn good liar. Anyway, I suggest you keep your nose clean until we can sit you down and go over this again. I'm not going to take you to the station now, but I will if I have to. Until then, you'll have an officer with you at all times. Wait, at all times. Teague touched his forefinger to his nose, then pointed it at Dan. You understand me? Yes, sir, Dan murmured. Adjusting his cap, Teague nodded, satisfied. Dan hardly felt the grip of the officer assigned to him. Felix would spend the night at the hospital with an officer waiting patiently to question him, while Dan was manhandled back to his room. A feeling of numb dread settled into his bones. I'll be right outside, said his jailer, so don't try anything funny. The irony of his room being used as a cell did not escape him. The whole night, the whole day now seemed like a dream. Particulars melted away, details disappeared. What did the man with the crowbar look like? He couldn't really remember now. Would Felix be able to corroborate Dan's story? He didn't know. He'd have to wait and see. He climbed into bed without feeling the mattress or blankets. It was strange to think that he was a suspect, that the police thought he had attacked Felix. Did they think he was responsible for Yi's attack too? And, oh God, no, Joe's murder? If they discovered he'd been blacked out in the basement, what would they say? All the evidence was against him. Outside the door, he heard his guard pacing slowly back and forth. I have to fight back, Dan thought, squeezing his eyes shut. His mind churned. Why would the sculptor have a crowbar? That was a blunt weapon, a clumsy one. The sculptor was smarter, crueler than that. It frightened Dan that he could come to that conclusion so easily. He didn't know the man, but he was beginning to understand, or at least recognize, his evil. And what did that say about him? Insanity is relative. It depends on who has who locked in what cage. Dan rolled onto his side, staring at the clock. If this was a fight against madness, he felt like he was losing. Maybe he already had. All right, everyone. I'm going to stop it there. Quite an interesting chapter. So they were quite excited during this chapter. I think it really got them pumped up and excited and being around and really wanting to be engaged directly with the story in the reading. But honestly, my two biggest suspects were either as to the current sculptor, Joe, the hall monitor's murderer, and the person who I guess attempted to murder Yi was either Felix or Jordan. And I was really kind of, when I read that when Dan got back to his room and Felix was gone, and right as he noticed Felix was gone, he had the message on his phone from the sculptor. I was thinking, the sculptor is definitely Felix. But now that Felix is out of the picture, I guess he's not. And that's another thing. All of these students left this chapter, but Felix stayed. There is absolutely a reason in this story, in the plot of this story, that Felix stayed. Could it just be so that, Felix could be attacked by this man with a crowbar? It's kind of insinuating that this man is not the sculptor, but then who is the sculptor and who is this man? Jordan is quite suspect right now. There was a reason that Dan, I guess, must have texted him. Jordan's really right now still the kind of wild card in this whole puzzle, in my opinion. And I'm hoping in chapter 30 and the few chapters that we have left, again, everything will be tied together. So until next time, thank you again for watching. This was Reading Time with Pickle.